and it was at that moment, the boy Yakub first came into the knowledge of just who he was, born to make trouble, break peace, kill and destroy, and be the enemy to the Ebenoid people of Earth. Yakub knew in order to accomplish his plan he would have to study science, biology, and genetics. Yakub was a child prodigy in school, being exceptionally smarter than the surface-dwelling humans he was going to school with, and by the age of 18, Yakub had finished all of the colleges and universities of his nation. While in college, Yakub was mocked and teased being called the big head scientist. After graduating from the colleges and universities of his nation, Yakub began to preach a new doctrine to the people in the city. Yakub called his new doctrine Tricknology, and his holy book was called the Book of Tricknology of 120 Degrees. Yakub taught that if people followed his doctrine, then they would be able to rule the world for 6,000 years, and make slaves out of everyone else on the earth. Yakub made such impressions on the people that many people began following him. The children who once mocked and teased Yakub were now requesting to be part of what he was teaching. The girls who once laughed at Yakub were now women who desired him. As Yakub's teachings spread, he made more and more converts to his new doctrine, and the power of Yakub's doctrine began to intimidate the king of the surface-dwelling humans, who ordered to have Yakub and all of his followers thrown in prison. The police arrested all of Yakub's followers and put them in prison, and filled up all of the prison cells with Yakub's followers. However, there was not enough space to put all of Yakub's followers in jail, therefore there were still some people free who were spreading Yakub's teachings. The police notified the king that they did not have enough space for all of Yakub's followers, and at that point the king decided to go to Yakub's prison cell and negotiate a deal. The king went to visit Yakub in his prison cell, and the king said, "So you are Mr. Yakub?" Yakub said, "Yes, I am." The king said, "Yakub, I have come to see if we could work out some agreement that would bring about an end to this trouble. What would you suggest?" Yakub said to the king, "If you give me and my followers everything to start a civilization, and furnish us with money and other necessities of life for 20 years, I will take my followers and we will leave." The king was pleased with the deal offered by Yakub, and agreed to take care of them for 20 years, until Yakub's followers were able to go for themselves. After 20 years, the government began to make preparation for the exiling of Yakub and his followers. The king ordered everyone rounded up who was a believer in Yakub's doctrine, and they took them to the seaport and loaded them on ships. When Yakub and his followers departed, there were a total of 59,999 followers, plus Yakub, making 60,000 total people on 100 ships. Yakub and his fleet of ships departed from an area 20 miles outside of the present-day city of Mecca, Saudi Arabia, and set sail on the Red Sea, and sailed all the way around the continent of Africa to go to their destination, which was the area which is currently called the island of Patmos, or Palam, in the Aegean Sea. While on the ships sailing around Africa to get to the area which is currently called the island of Patmos, Yakub began the second part of his plan, which was a eugenics human graftation experiment. Even though all of the people on the surface of the earth were of one tribe, the Ebenoid tribe, there was still some variation within the Ebenoid tribe, and Yakub began to highlight these differences, and Yakub taught these people that they were special, because Yakub planned to use them to graft his new tribe. Yakub developed his theory by studying his own genetics under the microscope and noticing that there were two different genes in him, one gene that was dark from his father Yishak's family, the Shayuk, and the other that was not dark from his mother Princess Lucina's family, the Sinin. Yakub began to have children with the women on this ship, and the babies which were born that were a lighter complexion he would spare their life, but the babies which were born which were of a darker complexion, Yakub would have thrown overboard into the ocean. Yakub felt if he could successfully separate the darker gene from the lighter gene, then he could graft the Ebenoid tribe into its last stage, which would be albinoid. Yakub planned to create a tribe of albinoids, which he discovered was weaker than the Ebenoid gene, which would be unalike, to rule the Ebenoid nation for 6,000 years. When Yakub's followers found out about his new wicked plan, and learned that he was killing and throwing babies overboard into the ocean, 95% of his followers lost their loyalty to Yakub, and abandoned his mission and jumped ship. As Yakub's fleet of ships sailed around Africa, people who lost loyalty to his mission would jump ship into the areas which are now Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Djibouti, Somalia, Mozambique, Namibia, Senegal, Morocco, and Tunisia. 10% of the original 60,000 of Yakub's followers betrayed Yakub and jumped ship. 85% of the original 60,000 of Yakub's followers jumped ship because they were confused why he would do such a horrible thing, leaving only 5% of the original 60,000 of Yakub's followers who actually made it to their destination of the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea. As king on his island, Yakub set up birth control and Planned Parenthood laws which would contribute to his plan of negative eugenics and genocide to breed his albinoid tribe. Yakub made it a law that only the lighter complexion people could have children. People with darker complexions were put to death, and when children were born, nurses were ordered to have the darker babies killed by pricking the brains with a sharp needle as soon as the child's head was out of the mother, but the lighter babies were allowed to live. Yakub's aim was to kill and destroy the Ebenoid nation. Yakub would have the dead bodies of the darker babies fed to wild beasts, and if they could not find a wild beast to feed the bodies to, they would take the dead bodies of the babies to a cremator to be burned. This is the level of intense hatred Yakub had in his heart. This process went on for years on Yakub's island as Yakub trained his sons and grandsons to carry on his work after he died. Yakub died at the age of 150 years old from a brain tumor. As the father of technology, Yakub taught his people a doctrine which would enable them to rule the world for 6,000 years. Yakub also taught his people that God is a spirit and a spook and not a man, and Yakub was the founder of the doctrine that unalike attracts and like repels. After 200 years on Yakub's island, all of the darker babies had been done away with, and all babies were born of a new tribe called the Rubetoid tribe. After another 200 years, all babies were born of an even newer tribe called the Citrinoid tribe. And finally, after another 200 years, which makes 600 years total, all the babies born on Yakub's island were of Yakub's desired albinoid tribe. It took 600 years to breed Yakub's albinoid tribe, and every imagination of their heart and all of their actions were wicked continuously. The evilness of the albinoids not only affected themselves, but also affected the other peoples of the world. Yakub's albinoids returned to the city where they were exiled from. Once back in the city, it took only 6 months for Yakub's albinoids to cause chaos and war amongst the Ebenoid people. The king of the Ebenoid people realized that it was Yakub's albinoids who were causing all the trouble, and the king made a decree to drive Yakub's evil albinoids from amongst them. The king rounded up all of Yakub's albinoids and stripped them of their clothing, and put an apron on them to hide their nakedness, and sent his army with them across the desert to cross the burning sands into the place which is modern-day Europe. Yakub's albinoids were roped into the mountains and caves, and the king's army would patrol the area to make sure Yakub's albinoids stayed in the mountains and caves for 2,000 years to ensure that these people are kept away from the Ebenoid people. During this 2,000-year period living in the mountains and caves without anything to start civilization, Yakub's albinoids became shameless, and lost all sense of shame and started going nude, and in the winter they wore animal skins for clothes and grew hair all over their bodies and faces like all the other wild animals. Yakub's albinoids tamed the wolves and dogs to live in the caves with them, and after some time the dog held a high place among their family, becoming their best friend. After 2,000 years of living in the caves, the wickedness of Yakub's albinoids was observed, and an Ebenoid man named Moshe was sent to civilize them. Moshe led Yakub's albinoids out of the caves. However, once out of the caves, Yakub's albinoids killed Moshe. Free from the caves, Yakub's albinoids went on a rampage throughout the earth, conquering and subjecting the Ebenoid people, pitting one against the other using the idea of divide and conquer. Yakub's albinoids began to execute Yakub's plan for them to rule the world for 6,000 years. A man named Mahamdu attempted to teach Yakub's albinoids to convince them to end their devilishment. However, this was still 1,400 years before the end of Yakub's albinoids' 6,000-year period of dominion over the earth. And so, Yakub's albinoids ruled the earth for 6,000 years, spreading their devilishment, evil, pain, suffering, and oppression to the Ebenoid people of the earth as designed by the big head scientist Yakub. The events of Yakub occurred approximately 6,600 years ago, and the 24 wise elder scientists of the inner earth foresaw the birth of Yakub 15,000 years ago. This history, or future, of Yakub and his people was predicted and foretold by the 24 wise elder scientists of the inner earth 8,400 years before the birth of Yakub. The 24 wise elder scientists of the inner earth were aware of the birth of Yakub, and they were aware of the things Yakub would do before Yakub was even born. The 24 wise elder scientists of the inner earth predicted that in the year 8,400, this man Yakub would be born, and when this man was born, he will change civilization in the world, and produce a new tribe of people, who would rule the original Ebenoid people for 6,000 years, from the 9,000th year to the 15,000th year. After the 6,000-year rule of Yakub's people, the Ebenoid people would give birth to one whose wisdom, knowledge and power would be infinite. One whom the world would recognize as being the greatest and mightiest since the creation of the universe, and that Yakub's old warring wicked world would be removed and destroyed, and the Ebenoid nation would be restored into power to rule forever and to establish a world of peace and righteousness. This great redeemer of the Ebenoid people, who was predicted by the 24 wise elder scientists of the inner earth to bring balance back into the world, is known